your, I shouldn't say your winter breaks, about things that can be done on winter break. After we did that, I told you that Unit 3, which is what we are in now, is all about storytelling. It's all about how we as performers, how we as playwrights, how we as theater artists more generally create original works, tell stories. So what we are going to look at today is one piece of how we as theater artists tell stories. And we are talking about dramaturgy. Dramaturgy. What is dramaturgy? In your notes, please write at the top of the page, what is dramaturgy? Also, I forgot to put it on there, but today's date, it is the 9th of January. Please also put today's date, it is the 9th of January. So today we are talking all about dramaturgy, which is a fun word to say. Everybody say it with me. Dramaturgy. All right, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Dramaturgy. Yeah. You expect that last G is going to be like a G sound, like dramaturgy, but it's not. It's dramaturgy. Otherwise, it would sound like turkey. All right, so what is dramaturgy? Well, I'm going to tell you in a second. Look at this. We have this question, what is dramaturgy? That is really sort of the focus of what we are talking about today, is this basic understanding of what dramaturgy is. And as just a preface to that, dramaturgy is a lot of other things that we are not talking about today. We are talking about one particular aspect of dramaturgy that serves our purposes for what we are doing in this class and what we are doing with dramaturgy. All right, so what is dramaturgy? Dramaturgy, in one way, is a way of making sense of a play. In a general sense, dramaturgy is a way of making sense of a play. And you can do this in a number of ways. For our purposes, we're only going to focus on one of the ways that we use dramaturgy to make sense of a play. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
It's so dark out, I don't want to turn the lights off because we're not going to get any light from the windows.
I don't like lights off.
But we're not going to get any light from the windows because it's so dark out.
But we can see the screen better.
So what is dramaturgy? Dramaturgy is a way of making sense of a play. And one of the ways that we make sense of plays, which is the way that we are going to focus on in this class, is by assessing their internal logic. One of the ways that we make sense of plays is through assessing their internal logic. Oh, did I just do your spot? Yeah, you probably don't want to sit right behind that computer anyway, so you can't see. One of the ways that we make sense of plays is through assessing their internal logic. What does that mean? First of all, what does assess mean? What does it mean to assess something? To test, right? To test that internal logic. What is internal logic?
Inside thinking.
What?
Inside thinking.
You're close. It is the thinking inside, right? So we've talked about this before. Anytime that we've done any kind of like storytelling warm-up, I remind you about the internal logic, which is the logic within the story being told. So in a way, Amy, you were right, that it is the inside thinking. It's the thinking inside of the story. And what we're really looking at is sort of the flow of the story. How do we get from event to event to event to event, from beginning to middle to end, right? And so we assess this internal logic, we test for how we get from event to event through looking at what are called triggers and heaps in a script. So we assess the internal logic of a script by looking at its triggers and heaps. We're going to talk about triggers and heaps in more depth in just a moment. So just for now, write down that we assess the internal logic of a script by looking at its triggers and heaps. And then in a moment, we're going to talk about what the heck I mean when I say triggers and heaps. Bless you. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay. Alrighty. So in answering this question, what is dramaturgy? In a general sense, dramaturgy is a way of making sense of a play. One of the ways that we can make sense of a play is by looking at its internal logic, or testing whether it makes sense from the beginning to the middle to the end. And we can do that by looking at the triggers and heaps. So this is sort of like if you think about it like a funnel, you've got your most general sense of what dramaturgy is, starts to get a little bit more specific and looking at it as a way of, testing the internal logic, and then most specific by triggering and heaping a script, which we're going to talk about how to do in a moment. So, when we talk about triggers and heaps in terms of dramaturgy, we are talking about it in this way. A trigger is an event that causes something to happen. A trigger is an event that causes something to happen. So it is an event in the storytelling, an event in the narrative that causes something to happen. So we call it a trigger because it is like pulling the trigger of a gun. That is an event that causes something to happen, right? If you know anything about the mechanics of a firearm, when you pull the trigger, things happen inside of the gun to make the bullet come out. I don't know how they happen because I don't know the mechanics of a firearm. So a trigger is an event that causes something to happen in the story. It's like pulling the trigger of a gun. This causes something to happen both within the actual chamber of the gun, and then also it causes something to happen once that bullet is released, right? And that is where we get heap. A heap is an event that happens as the result of some other event. A heap is an event that happens as the result of some other event. We borrow the name from falling into a heap after you're being shot, right? So trigger and heap. So the trigger is something that causes something else to happen. So you pull the trigger on your gun, and then the heap is something that happens because you did that. You fall in a heap because you were shot, right? So simply put, we can think about triggers as being causes, and we can think about heaps as being what?
The cause and effect.
Right, cause and effect. So when we're looking at the internal logic in a story, and we're using triggers and heaps to look at that internal logic, we are really testing the cause and effect in that story. We are looking at how do we get from point A to point B to point C and so on and so forth, all the way from beginning to middle to end. Give me one moment. What's that? Yeah. All right. So, when we're looking at a story, when we're looking at a play, we are looking at the events in that narrative as triggers and heaps. So we look at each event as causing the next event, which means that each trigger has a corresponding heap, and then that heap turns into a trigger for the next event. Because in a well-written script, each moment directly causes the next moment. So the way that looks like is, if we're continuing this metaphor of shooting a gun and being shot, right? Because that's where we get these names of trigger and heap. The trigger, someone pulls the trigger on a gun. The heap, someone falls into a heap after being shot. But now the person who has fallen into a heap, they fall, and they fall into someone else and knock them over. So now that person falling into a heap is now a trigger for another person being bumped into. Does that make sense? Kind of. It's okay if it doesn't totally make sense at this point, because we're gonna use a really super concrete example in a moment. But the important thing for you to remember about this idea of triggers and heaps is that each heap becomes a trigger for the next moment. So every moment causes the next moment. So the play starts with one trigger and ends with one heap, and everything in between there is both a trigger and a heap, which we're going to talk about in more depth using a more concrete example in a moment. But at this point, are there any questions about triggers and heaps?
No.
Are you sure? Because it's super confusing.
I understand.
Okay.
Like you shoot someone, they die,
Wow.
but then someone else gets angry that you shot them, and shoot the other person.
Kinda. Yeah. It seems a little circular, right? And that in some ways is intentional, because we don't ever want it to be that something happens, causes something else to happen, and then nothing ever is done about that, right? Because that wouldn't really make any sense in the narrative. So we want to make sure that each event, each moment in that script causes the next moment to happen. All right, so this is all super, super important stuff, so take a moment to write it down, especially those of you that are coming in late. If you have already written the notes for this slide, will you please raise your hand? Because I need something from you. Annabelle, I need a name of a teacher you like. Don't overthink it, just pick a teacher. Okay. Alright. Awkward. Alrighty, Izzy, you had your hand raised. I need a name of another teacher you like.
Mr. Yoder. He's pretty cool.
Okay, Veda, did you raise your hand?
Yeah.
Okay, what's a third teacher? What's someone that you like?
Garcia.
Garcia?
Mr. Garcia.
Okay. Alright. Take about 30 more seconds to write down this slide, and then we're going to move on. Okay. I only need 3, but thank you.
I want to give it all of you. It's so weird.
It's okay. Next time.
2.
My goodness. All right. Do we have these notes for triggers and heaps?
Yep.
Mostly? Seems like we need a little bit more time, because this is super important, so I want to make sure that you have the time to write it. And I will, before we move on to the next one. one more slide, so make sure you've got what's on this one, then we're going to move on to the last one, and then we are going to start actually looking at triggers and heaps in a story. Hopefully, one that y'all are familiar with.
Hamilton.
No, it's not.
It's literally the exact definition. He shoots someone.
It's sort of not, but at least the way that that narrative is written. All right. So we look at triggers and heaps in a story for a variety of reasons. We look at a script and we analyze its triggers and heaps to make sure that it maintains that internal logic, right? That each event makes sense with the next event and so on and so forth from beginning to middle to end. And thus we can use triggers and heaps as a way of revising our own work. We can use it to look at our own work and make sure that all of the events in the narrative that we have created make sense together, that the flow of events makes causal sense, right? That each event causes the next event. So the important thing to remember with analyzing triggers and heaps is that you do it backwards. You analyze triggers and heaps backwards. You look first at the end of the story to see how the events of the story build toward the conclusion. So when you are reading a script, you read it from beginning to end, right? But when you are analyzing it for its triggers and heaps, you start at the end of the story. You start at the end of the story to make sure that the internal logic of that script is moving to that conclusion, right? And if it's not, if something falls apart along the way, then that means that there's an issue with the narrative, which if it's something that you wrote, gives you a great opportunity to say, okay, how can I fix that narrative? Okay, told you this was the last slide on dramaturgy and the last slide on triggers and heaps. So are we sure we don't have any questions? Okay, take 10 more seconds to write down this slide and then I'm going to turn off the projector.